We are now in week 8 of Trump's war in Iran. Tehran and Washington are now preparing for another round of peace talks in Pakistan. Vice President J.D. Vance will again lead the delegation. Jared Kushner, Steve Witkoff, and officials from the Pentagon, the National Security Council, and the State Department will also be with him. Noteworthy, Secretary of State Marco Rubio will not. One foreign diplomat in Iran who is in contact with its leaders told MS Now that they would only attend the talks if the vice president was there. Vance also led, if you recall, the unsuccessful meeting that took place earlier this month. And earlier this evening, the president spoke about what he expects from the upcoming negotiations.
They're going to negotiate, and if they don't, they're going to see problems like they've never seen before, and they're going to negotiate, and hopefully they'll make a fair deal, and they'll build their country back up, but they will not have, when they do it, they will not have a nuclear weapon. They will have no access to, no chance of having a nuclear weapon.
Okay, these latest talks pick up against escalating tensions in the region. Over the weekend, the two sides essentially resumed hostilities, otherwise known as started fighting again. The U.S. Navy seized an Iranian-flagged tanker near the Gulf of Oman after firing on it, according to President Trump. U.S. Central Command reported that the blockade has redirected 27 ships since it began. As a result, Iran halted commercial traffic through the Strait of Hormuz just one day after reopening the critical shipping channel, and the 14-day truce between the two nations is set to expire on Wednesday night. Today, the president told Bloomberg News that it was highly unlikely that he'd be interested in extending it. But I want to just level set with you. We've heard a lot of things from our president over the course of the last week, and many of those things turned out not to be true. Here's just a few. On Friday, he said that Iran agreed to never close the Strait of Hormuz. Again, as we just said, not true. The same day, he also claimed that Iran has agreed to everything, including an indefinite moratorium on nuclear activity and the surrender of enriched uranium stockpiles. Untrue. The longest nuclear moratorium Tehran has offered up was 5 years, and the Iranian Foreign Ministry quickly denied that they would ever transfer materials out of their country. Today, Trump repeated the claim that Iran's Navy, Air Force, anti-missile and anti-aircraft capabilities were gone. That is not quite true either. Despite being seriously degraded by the U.S. and Israel assaults, it is clear that they remain operational. So now the question is, should we start believing the president tonight? Well, we don't know. So we will just have to wait and see exactly how the peace process plays out and figure it out for ourselves. All right, now it is time to get smarter with the help of our leadoff panel this evening. Luke Broadwater is here, Pulitzer Prize-winning White House correspondent for The New York Times. Lieutenant General Mark Hertling, a retired commander of the U.S. Army Europe. And Gautam Mukunda, executive fellow and lecturer at the Yale School of Management. Luke, the president says he does not feel pressured to come to an agreement with Iran. He will not be rushed into making a bad deal. So what does he want to come of these talks, realistically?
Well, I mean, if you listen to his public bluster, it's a complete capitulation from the Iranians. He says, and he claims they've already agreed to all of it. They've agreed to every single one of the American demands to fully reopen the Strait of Hormuz, to give the United States all of what he calls nuclear dust, which, if you talk to anybody who knows anything about nuclear programs, is not a thing. There's no such thing called nuclear dust. So he's making all these demands, but it's not clear that he has a mastery of the facts of the situation. It's not always clear he's aware of what's happening within his own administration. He seemed to think at first J.D. Vance wasn't going to Pakistan, and then he seemed to think he was already there. And obviously he's not there yet, and he's preparing for negotiations, not currently involved in the negotiations. So it's a lot of unreliable information coming out of the president's own mouth that sometimes his own aides are having to correct to us in the media, right after he says them. So it's if you're looking at Donald Trump for good and reliable information about what's happening with this war, you're looking at the wrong place.
Luke, I think you're being generous in saying unreliable. We're in the middle of a war, and the president is repeatedly, and I'm going to say knowingly, not telling us the truth. Gautam, the president also posted this. The deal that we are making with Iran will be far better than the JCPOA, which was the nuclear deal President Obama negotiated. And remember, Trump pulled out of that deal in his first term. What is your reaction to that?
Well, I'd be curious if he knows what the terms of the JCPOA are, just to start off with, so he can declare anything better as long as he says that. He's not bound by those strictures. But it's just worth noting that if the only way he'd get that is essentially a complete Iranian capitulation, and the Iranian demands now are actually considerably more aggressive than the ones they were making before the war began, if you think you're losing, you don't escalate what you're asking for. So it seems to me like the Iranians don't feel a lot of pressure to back down right now.
Oof. General, in another post, the president says, this is sort of the perfect segue. The president says, I'm winning by a lot. What is your take?
Well, I can't define by a lot, Stephanie. And one of the things that I think your opening was great. We're all searching for ground truth. You know, I'm suffering quite a bit because in my old career as a commander with access to secret and top secret information, you had ground truth. But this back and forth and this messaging and this branding, which is coming from someone who's used to doing that to try and persuade people to buy real estate or work a deal, isn't working in the international community. The Iranians have his number. And just like we're kind of questioning the truthfulness or the veracity of the statements, so are the Iranians. And that's what they're saying. They don't want to deal with him. They've asked for Vice President Vance because I think he's the only one they can trust right now, other than real estate magnates like Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff. So it is confusing, to be sure. And this is not a way to run a war, especially if you say you're winning it by a lot, because you're not. President Trump is finding himself in a corner right now. He's trying to make a deal desperately. He's wishing it happened, and it's not going to happen because he's up against some pretty good negotiators in Iran. And truthfully, they have the upper hand in terms of controlling the Strait of Hormuz.
I want to go into that deeper, but let's just talk, Luke, for a moment about Vice President Vance. He's leading these talks again. This is the second effort. Do you think this is a test, a public test of his standing here at home and abroad, and it's noteworthy? Again, the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, not participating.
Yeah, it's a test of J.D. Vance in a couple of arenas. I mean, one, President Trump himself said that if J.D. is successful, that President Trump will take all the credit, and if he fails, that the failure will rest on J.D. Vance's shoulders. So, you know, he's in some ways he may be setting him up as sort of a fall guy if the war isn't resolved, that, you know, my vice president couldn't get the job done and couldn't seal the deal. You know, the other thing here is this tricky political question, which is that, you know, J.D. Vance had long positioned himself as more isolationist and not someone who wanted to get into wars of adventurism. And he even let it be known quietly and that he wasn't really in favor of this war, and he had spoken out against it in private before backing the president's decision. So now he is here in this situation where he's tasked with getting an end to the war. And I guess if he's able to do that, he could win back some of those MAGA faithful who have become a little disillusioned with him as he's, you know, walked hand in glove with President Trump in defending this war.
Gautam, increasingly, it seems like the ultimate goal for the U.S. is to get the Strait of Hormuz open and oil flowing again. But that was certainly not the goal when this war started, right?
Yeah, basically, we are now we are in a situation where we are negotiating after the war to get back to a situation we would have fought a war to prevent. So we created exactly the problem that we are now trying to solve. And if you sort of the larger position here that makes this such a sort of strategic nightmare for us is the U.S. military has an incredible ability to inflict pain on Iran, and we can do that with a blockade. There are lots of things we can do to coerce the Iranians. But they care a lot more about the outcome than we do, right? It is much more important to the Iranian government to stay in power than it is for us to displace them from power. Their stability, their security, all these things matter. So they can take enormous amounts of pain as we dish it out, while they can inflict it on us by shutting the Straits of Hormuz. And since we don't care as much, our pain tolerance isn't as high. If J.D. Vance can solve that problem and extract a strategic victory for the United States out of that, he probably deserves to be president of the United States, because that's just a nightmarish problem.